We are very lucky to have her with us tonight, Professor Dr. Nelleke IJssennagger-van der Pluijm. Uh, Nelleke is the director of the Fryske Akademy or Frisian Academy, which is situated in Leeuwarden in the Netherlands, which is a venerable hub of all manner of research on Frisia and its culture and language and peoples in an international and an interdisciplinary context. And as of this month, Nelleke has also been appointed Professor of Cultural History of the Southern North Sea area in the early medieval and Viking ages at the University of Groningen by special appointment. I hope I got all of that right. I think congratulations are very much in order here. Nelleke was awarded her PhD in 2017 for her thesis entitled Central Because Liminal, Frisia in a Viking Age North Sea World. She has previously also worked as curator for the Fries Museum, so the Frisian Museum, which is also in Leeuwarden, and for the National Trust in Cornwall. Her research is focused on the history of Frisia and its related regions, on the Viking world, on intercultural contact, and on the role of coastal areas through the lens of history, archaeology, language, and culture. She's especially fascinated by areas that are considered liminal and where oral cultural transmission would have taken place during the early medieval and the Viking Age. And today, I think Nelleke will be talking to us about a little bit of all of those things, as her paper is titled Frisia and the Viking Age. So Nelleke, thanks so much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Can you all hear me? Is everything okay with the sound? I hope so. If not, I suppose someone tells me. Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction, really. You've told a lot already, but thank you also very much for this invitation to share with you today some research on Frisia and the Viking Age. And indeed, I will be talking a little bit about all those different things that you've mentioned, Chris. But I've also tried to really make it a sort of an introduction to Frisia and the Viking Age. So there might be some things that either are familiar to you or things that spark questions. So I look forward very much to hearing from you all if there's anything that sparks your interest or that you have questions about at the end, because this is very much an introduction setting the scene of Frisia and the Viking Age. But indeed, I thought, and now I hope my slides are working. Yes, here they are. I thought I'd start with a very, very short introduction also of the place where I work, the Fryske Akademy or Frisian Academy, because it might not be so familiar to you all, but it should be. So I'm hoping that after tonight, you know more about it and also that you know where to find us. So the Fryske Academy is a research institute for the study of Frisian language, culture, history, heritage, and also the same topics in related regions. And we've been around since 1938, so that's quite a long time. We also have a dedicated research center for multilingualism and minority language. So that's very much a European part of our work. And we work with a multidisciplinary team. We have a core research team. But of course, we also have supporting staff. And we also have a network. So despite being a relatively small research institute, our network is much larger and also includes guest researchers, affiliated researchers, and others. So if you're interested in these topics, then please have a look at our website. So as Chris mentioned, I have been studying Frisia and the Viking Age through a number of different routes over time. And one of the things I've noticed is that our perception of Frisia and the Viking Age, but also the interest in the topic has changed quite a bit over time. And I think for us as researchers, the long short of that is that as a research community, we have realized that there is much more to tell about Frisia and the Viking Age than we previously maybe thought. Also more to tell about the impact of the Viking Age on Frisia as a region. And this has come, I think, through a reconsideration of the sources, but also a reconsideration of how we can approach those sources, and by a better understanding of what happens in the world around Frisia and how we can relate those developments to Frisia and learn from each other. So hopefully this is something I can share with you today. But every now and then, these developments also are helped by new finds and new insights that come into play. And this sword pommel piece that you see on the screen now is an example of this. This is a find found by a metal detectorist called Sander Visser, whom I believe is in the audience tonight. And this sword pommel piece really created a buzz, first of all in the Netherlands, but also internationally. It even made it onto Fox News for reasons very much unknown to me. But this sword pommel piece really created a buzz, and we can tell that this is a true Viking sword pommel fragment. We can see it from the decorations and the style that it really is. And because it's such an undisputable Viking find, and one of the first to be found on the continent, and certainly the first in the Netherlands and in Frisia, this really sparked a lot of interest. It is a piece from the 10th century, and it was found in Witmarsum in Frisia, and you can see it on the map with the yellow star. And you can see in the decoration that it's very stylistic, and it has boar's heads on profile at the end, so it's quite recognizable. And the boar, of course, being a symbol for power and protection. It has one near parallel from the British Isles. We're not sure where, but certainly from the British Isles. And then we have further close related parallels in Norway, England, but also in Hedeby, Haithabu in Germany. And probably also further east, but those are not tracked as to date, so I haven't put them on the map. And as this, being a first, it has really sparked some questions, not just from researchers, but also from the general audience. And the main question, of course, is who did it belong to? Whose was this? But also, why is it found here in Frisia? How did it get here? And how does it fit with the story of Frisia and the Viking Age? And the first question, whose was this? We cannot really answer for certain. But the latter question we can answer. So how does it fit with the story of Frisia and the Viking Age? And this is a story that we can now tell also thanks, I think, to the research of the past couple of years. Now, to tell that story, I think it's very helpful to start with a navigation of the North Sea area more generally, both geographically but also through time, because the story of Frisia and the Viking Age very much is one of ongoing North Sea connections. And understanding these, I think, really helps to understand what Frisia is and what the Viking Age brings to this region. And that will be the second half of my story. Well, as you all will know, the North Sea is the water body that connects the coasts of various places, such as the British Isles and, of course, West and South Scandinavia, Germany, the Netherlands, and even down to Belgium and France. And quite often if we talk about it in the context of the early medieval period, at least in the research in my area, it is referred to as the Mare Frysicum, so the Frisian Sea. But it's actually uncertain whether it was ever really known as the Mare Frysicum. There's also discussions about the terms Mare Frysicum being used for other seas or estuaries, for example, even the Humber or the further forth or the sea between Scotland and Ireland, but I think that's a matter for a different time. But the North Sea has also been called in early medieval and Viking times the Oceanus Frisonicus, and this, together also with references to Frisians as sailors, as traders, as people with a very strong maritime connection, this does really strengthen the idea of the North Sea being a Frisian sea, both the North Sea and the estuaries being a Frisian sea, especially in the period before it becomes a Norse sea in the Viking Age. Now, to understand Frisia a bit more, the North Sea is connected to the Wadden Sea area that you can see here. And the Wadden Sea area is the largest tidal flat area in the world, and therefore is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And the islands and the mainland coasts together form a geographical, a natural, but also a cultural continuum. And there is this constant dynamic of water, land, and it changes the scenery all the time. Today, it stretches across 3 national borders, so the borders of 3 national countries, so the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. But actually today, as it did previously in historic terms, this coincides with the core regions of the Frisians. And as you can imagine, living in this landscape, the Frisian lifestyle, the Frisian worldview was very much impacted by this landscape, very, very much shaped by it. And of course, there was no such thing as the Netherlands or Germany or Denmark at the time, especially not in the way we think of it today. So I think it's very helpful if we talk about the Viking Age, but also about the early medieval period, that we talk about the cultural units of the time. And Frisia is one such unit. What we consider historic Frisia is a bit different from what we see as Frisia today. But we consider historic Frisia to be the southern North Sea or the northern continental coastal area. And it stretches more or less from the border between present day the Netherlands and Belgium, all the way up to the river Weser in Germany in the northeast. But then we also have a North Frisian region that you can see pointed out on the map here as well, which is an additional Frisian area. Now, the reason we think this is the area is actually comes from a legal text, a legal collection from around 800 AD, which is called the Lex Frisianum, so the laws of the Frisians. And it was one of the Leges Barbarorum, so one of the laws of the barbarian people, the groups of people that were subdued by the Franks and incorporated in the Frankish realm, and whose laws were recorded at the instigation of the Franks, so recorded in Latin as well, rather than in the vernacular. And this was around 800 AD. So we know from this text that, at least from a Frankish perspective, this was the area that was seen as Frisian around 800 AD, and that this is the area where Frisian law is also prevailing. Now, historically, as well as geographically, the Frisian area can be divided into different Frisian regions. We already mentioned the North Frisian region, which is slightly separate. But then we also have within the large area of Frisia, a West Frisian area, a Central Frisian area, and an East Frisian area. And you can see it on the map here, the different Frisian areas, they are all bound by the different waterways. So we have West Frisia, which runs all the way up to the Vlie. And I hope you can see my arrow. This is the Vlie. I pointed out here. Then we have the Central Frisian area, which runs to the Lauwers, and then we have the East Frisian area that runs to the east of the Lauwers all the way over here. And even though these are different regions within Frisia, also marked as different territories, we know that jointly they are seen to make up Frisia. Well, the North Frisian region, I already mentioned, is slightly separate. So it's separated over land by a sort of Saxon structure of coast. But the North Frisian region we still see as a Frisian region. And this is because we know that from the 7th century onwards, there was Frisian settlement here. We know this from archaeology, but we also know this from linguistic research, where we find the oldest branches of Frisian attested here, first on the islands and later also on the mainland. The archaeological research has also really changed considerably over the last couple of years, thanks to our German colleagues. And they have discovered that in the 7th and 8th century, there are newly founded villages, harbour and trading sites that all flourish and that display very intensive trading contacts along the southern North Sea coast, so towards Central and West Frisia, but also to South Scandinavia. So really, we're starting to understand the importance of this Northern Frisian area as a sort of in-between area, a liminal zone, I would almost say, between the Scandinavian world and Frisia proper, thanks to their research. Now, North Frisia did not become part of the Frankish realm, the Frankish Empire, as the rest of Frisia did. So we also don't have the laws recorded in a similar fashion. So we don't know whether there were any similar laws or whether they weren't. But at least they are not recorded, so we don't know this. And also, we don't know the demarcation of the area in the same way because of this. So, yeah, we have to guess a little bit considering that. So this historic Frisian area was very interesting for many reasons, but also in terms of the landscape. You can see it is a coastal zone that was quite exposed, so it has very exposed salt marshes. Then there are the geest edges, which also show marine influence. And you can see the many different tidal creeks and rivers and peat bogs that also mark the landscape. And you can understand that this was a landscape that was heavily impacted by the sea and by the tide, and that all of this shaped the daily life and also the worldview very much. The nature of the landscape, and just to point out, in the hope that you can see what I see, the green areas are the fertile and also inhabitable areas, more or less, the darker green. The lighter green is the tidal range. And then the brown areas, they are all more or less impenetrable peat areas. So this means very much that the inhabitable area is only a small strip, relatively speaking, along the rivers and along the coast. And that overland, people were very much cut off from the hinterland. So this is something to bear in mind. The area was characterized by dwelling mounds, which we call terpen. And as said, you had the small dikes and ditches, etc. And the landscape was used for both trading, agriculture, maritime connections, etc. You have West Frisia, which is characterized by the islands all the way down southwest, the islands of Zealand. Then you have a large stretch of dunes intersected by the main rivers. And then in the north, next to the Vlie, which again you can see here, you have the islands of Texel and Wieringen, which are quite strategic places, and that forms West Frisia. And then in Central Frisia, you can see two very core regions, which are Westergo and Oostergo. And you can see that this almost forms a peninsula at the time. And again, it's bordering the Vlie, which was an important waterway. And then East Frisia, North Frisia, more or less form a continuum from Central Frisia onwards. As said, the life in the coastal marshes meant that people more or less lived in habitational cores. So it's not that the whole area was populated. They lived on the turbs and they lived in certain core sites. And these again then were separated by small creeks, by small watercourses, and by peat bogs. This all happened, or this all stayed the same until the middle of the 11th century, when the peat was starting to get reclaimed. So this is that the period when it starts to change. But it does mean that throughout the Viking Age, the landscape very much looks like this. This, of course, also means that the people living on this coastal edge, which is why I refer to it as a more or less liminal zone, they were very focused towards the North Sea, maybe more so than towards the inland. And of course, this shapes the contact that people have. So the Vlie I already mentioned a number of times, and that's with good reason, because I think it is an important waterway that we sometimes underestimate. But one of the reasons it was very important is because it connected the north and the North Sea area with the hinterland through here, and then of course over the main rivers. For example, towards Dorestad, which was a very important trading site that I'm sure some of you have heard of, if not all. It also means that places that were bordering the Vlie were very strategically important, so Wieringen and Texel, but also this part of Westergo. And this also meant something for the accumulation of wealth in these areas. And I hope that you will recognize from one of the first slides that the sword pommel piece was found along here. So along this part of Westergo, and so along the former Vlie, and that will not be without reason, of course. The Vlie also, so it is a connector between the North Sea and the north with the inland, but it also is a bit of a divider between the different parts of Frisia. And one of the things that really stands out in research is that West Frisia was much more connected to the Frankish politics and also economy than Central and East Frisia. So I think there is a real difference here. And also Danish influence in the form of Danish benefices that were granted by Frankish rulers. They appear more in West Frisia and not at all in Central Frisia, possibly a bit in East Frisia. And this is all with reason. And in my talk, my main focus is on this Frisia, Central Frisia, but also in general, more Frisia east of the Vlie, which forms one consecutive landscape. As I mentioned, this landscape, of course, created a certain northward look towards the other maritime areas and along the coast. And this impacted what contacts people had with others. And for centuries, through this maritime mobility, riverine mobility, the coastal dwellers, they created a very strong network with their neighbors. So neighboring coastal dwellers along the same coasts, but also neighbors overseas. And the relations between people were so strong, especially in the pre-Viking period, you can see some example here, that it's almost impossible to disentangle them at some points. This is an example from ADNA research that was recently published, for instance, which shows how close the connections were between the different peoples and how difficult it is to separate between what we would consider Frisian or Saxon or Jutish or British, whatever it may be. And of course, there's also a lot of discussion about the use of these terms in general and what we mean by them. And that's a discussion I'm not going to go into too much. So the close connection between those coastal dwellers created very much an interlinked region of coastal dwellers, an interlinked area with very strong connections, but also with regional variation. And you can see exchange and continuous tradition along the coast. And in my research, this is one of the things I do is I sort of consider the North Sea area as one coherent cultural zone with lots of regional variation. And I always think it's best shown by putting the map upside down, because that gives me a very strong image of the coherence of the North Sea area, the prominence of Frisia that you can see here within that area, and also the importance of the Vlie, which would have been around here as a sort of, well, I don't know, a sort of entrance onto the mainland and into the continent. So this is always a very helpful picture for me. So this idea of approaching the North Sea area as a joint coherent region is of course not new. It has precursors, especially in the research around the Mediterranean. There is very interesting research by Horden and Purcell, who've published on the Mediterranean, and they speak not only of connectivity between the different coastal regions there, but even of an inside-out geography, and I really like this term, where the water and the coast, they form the center, and actually the inland is the periphery, rather than the other way around as we usually think. And this also has to do with the fact that the hinterland, in periods of maritime mobility, is very much less accessible than the coast. And this, of course, has geographical circumstance behind it. And I think this certainly holds true for the North Sea area as well, particularly in the early medieval period, but also in the Viking period, where, from West Norway, it was easier to travel to Northern England or to Jutland. And from Jutland, it was easier to sail to Frisia than to travel overland to the respective hinterlands. This is, of course, much aided by also social and cultural contacts between the different regions, and especially also the movement of people. And just to give you a very brief historic overview to place this in perspective, I think this helps to then go into the Viking period a bit more. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Frisia saw a real decline of population, and then there was a repopulation again, which was connected to the Germanic migrations in the 5th to 6th centuries. And this means that the Frisians that we encounter in antique sources, usually the first sources to describe Frisia and the Frisians, they are not the same people, not the same Frisians as the Frisians of the early medieval sources and onwards. And these Frisians from the early medieval sources onwards, we call them New Frisians in the academic discourse. And these New Frisians, they came from areas that we would now call Saxon or maybe North Frisian. So if you think about that, and knowing now that in the 7th to 8th century, North Frisia was populated by a Frisian migration, it is not a one-off, but it seems that there is historically a connection between those areas moving back and forth. So the question, who's the original inhabitant and who is the Frisian here is a very interesting one. So it's a remaining link rather than a one-off migration. There is still a bit of a debate about, a linguistic debate about whether the Old Frisians were in fact speakers of Germanic languages or speakers of a Celtic language. And of course, the debate is also about how this then relates to demographic developments, not just in Frisia, but also in the British Isles. And if that is of your interest, I would highly recommend this volume by Peter Schrijver about language contact and the origins of the Germanic languages, as well as his article in the volume that you see here about Frisians and the North Sea neighbour. I think it's very interesting to read. From the 6th century onwards, Frisia very much formed a recognizable cultural and geographical area. And from then on, we also encountered the name Frisia quite regularly in different places. Frisia as merchants, Frisians as Germanic peoples dwelling, etc. We also encounter King Redbad as a king. We encounter Dorestad as a famous place. So this is when Frisia really is starting to emerge and to boom. To put a very long story short, because I realize time is moving on, this is when we see such shared developments in different areas of the North Sea that we call it the North Sea culture. Now, what we often think, at least from a Dutch perspective, is that this is the situation before the Viking Age. But then when the Viking Age starts, we forget about this Frisia because we see something else that's coming in its place. And that is the continent of the Frankish, Carolingian, and Christian rulers. So in our perception, this is the early medieval period, and this is from 800 AD onwards. And we think often of this as not just the Frankish period, but the period where the Frankish sources are the written sources or the only written sources to tell us something about the history of the time. And this, I think, has been aided by the fact that often we've missed archaeological evidence of a Viking impact. And this now, of course, has changed over the last couple of years. Of course, there definitely is a Frankish impact and a Frankish power sphere which moved northwards in the 8th century. And it does mean that around 800 AD, Frisia has been sucked into the continental and land-based power sphere. And you can see here the different phases in which that happens for the different areas of Frisia. There was, of course, a mission, a military campaign, but also a religious mission, which drove the borders of the Frankish Empire north towards south of Denmark. And it did mean that Frisia formerly was part of this now Christian continental world, whereas northern Frisia probably was more part of the Danish area. And this is also when we then get the Lex Frisianum, which records this area, of course. And if you're interested in who rules Frisia after that in the 9th century, there is a new article by Reverend Dr. Simon Coupland, who may also be in the audience, who talks about who rules Frisia after that. And I can highly recommend reading that. But what I'm trying to show is that we've often assumed that this also means that, because the sources change and our perspective changes, that this also automatically means that the perspective of the Frisian coastal dwellers changed. So rather than being directed towards the north, they are now directed towards the continent, towards Frankish politics and the south. But of course, at the same time, something else happens around the North Sea, and that is the Viking Age. Now, the Viking Age, of course, comes with something else, a new dynamic in the North Sea area. And the question, of course, is what this means for Frisia. So what we see around the North Sea, of course, the Viking Age, you're all very familiar with it, but we see that the activities of Vikings mark a new phase of the coherence and the connections. And it basically is a new phase of the continuation of North Sea maritime mobility. Of course, we have the raid, we have the trade, we have the power play that comes with the Viking Age. We have a great heathen army that roams the British Isles, but also the continent, and that creates an interlinked area, especially between Scandinavia proper and the east of England with the Danelaw. But it also means very much that things change for the Frankish Empire. It heavily affects and impacts the Frankish realm, and therefore, or maybe most heavily, also the northern Frisian coast. The traditional narrative proposes this somewhat dramatically to a strong clash between the north and the south, between Vikings and Christian continentals. And this clash is then situated between, sort of on the border between the Danish and the Frankish areas. And of course, with the realization that Frisia and Saxony were within the Frankish-controlled area. But of course, there are alternatives to these stories. There are also stories in which Frisia actually is seen more within the Danish sphere. We have references to Frisians partaking in the Great Heathen Army, for example. And Adam of Bremen, who writes in the 11th century, he writes about the year 884 and says then that from then on, Frisia and England are both said to be subjected to the Danes, as the writings of the Angles say. So you can see that even in historic sources, there are alternatives to the simple Frankish perspective. So in my view, and I think the references clearly show this, it's not as simple as Frisia becoming part of Francia, and therefore it's on the Frankish side when the Viking Age starts to boom and hit. But really, Frisia is still very much a part of the North Sea world they've been in touch with for so long. But of course, we enter a new phase of dynamics, both on the side of the North Sea, but also with the fact that we get a new political situation with Frankish overlordship and new power spheres. And I think that the alternative to that story, so there still being a North Sea story as well, is a bit obscured in our sources because of the availability of textual material. And I'll try and go into that a little bit more. So one of the things I'm suggesting is that to understand that story and to understand the Frisian perspective, we need to, first of all, realize that there is a difference between the political level and the cultural level, and that these are not necessarily the same. I think another thing to remember is that even though Frisia becomes part of the Frankish realm, the Frankish overlordship and the Frankish incorporation met with fierce resistance by the Frisians. So it's not simply a case of agreeing that they are now part of Francia. There was much more to it. But of course, the Frankish written records may not always portray this in the same way. I think on top of that, what we also see in the Frankish records is that they have an importance, they attach an importance to certain places and also share a lot about it. And that we often think that that is then the story of the Viking Age in those places. But I don't think they represent the entire story of Frisia and the Viking Age, which is much more differentiated and has different aspects. And I'll try to highlight this very briefly with the example of Dorestad, which was a famous trading place, and which has always been connected to the question of Frisia and the Vikings, and especially also the Low Countries and the Vikings. And this comes through references in primarily the Frankish annals to the Viking raids on Dorestad primarily, but also to Frisia more generally. And these raids, they start in 810 AD, and you can see the example of 810 here. And what you see is that often those references are to Frisia in general. And while having just seen how large the area Frisia is, it's very difficult to then know where exactly this was. And Dorestad is one of the few exceptions that are mentioned specifically. Also, we have some clearly cultural items from the Viking world that we recognize in this trading place. And I think together, also because of the lack of these finds elsewhere in the Netherlands and in Frisia, this has meant that we focus very much on Dorestad for understanding the Viking Age in our region. But this is not, I think, the right way to go. Not denying the importance of Dorestad at all, because it's a really important site. But I think we have to remember that it is one site of a very specific nature, and that it cannot function as the storytelling element for the whole of the Viking Age or the whole of Frisia for a number of reasons, some of which you can also see on the screen. But if we want to understand Frisia and the Viking Age, my point is that we need to also look elsewhere to find the evidence. So if we look on a very local and regional level, particularly in Frisia east of the Vlie, what we see is that a lot of things don't change with the coming of either the Franks or the Vikings. So we see that life on the Terp side very much is continuing into the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. We see that the everyday life material culture is not changing much. We see that a lot of things stay the same, even though we find hints of both Frankish and Viking influence, there isn't a huge sudden difference in the material at all. And we still see the general developments that reflect the North Sea developments in North Sea context. Of course, there is regional variation between the different areas, but that was also the case before this period. One of the things to mention is that we do see regional variation, especially between the western part of Frisia and central and eastern part of Frisia. And this primarily has to do with the impact of the Frankish realm. So in the western Frisian area, we do see manorial structures, but they're absent on the other side of the Vlie. And we also see that in the burial rite in central, east, and north Frisia, there is less evidence of the Frankish influence. And we see that despite bans on the use of grave goods, for example, we still get grave goods, and we even get Christian grave goods, as you can see here in this example. The research of my colleagues Gilles de Lange and Hans Mol into the parish boundaries in the early medieval period, and you can see some examples here from around 1000 AD, has also highlighted how this central and also East Frisia differs from other regions by the slow progress of the establishment of the parishes and the churches. So even though Christianity was introduced around 800 AD, it was very difficult to actually establish the churches and to get the Christianization through full speed. We even know that there was a second conversion in the 12th century AD, which was needed to actually get a firm foot on the ground. And they also suggest that this is because there was not such a close link with the Frankish hinterland at all, as in some of the other regions, but that there was ongoing contact with the non-Christian regions in the north, and particularly with Denmark, where, of course, Christianization came around 1000 AD, so that this has really impacted the church foundations in Frisia. And this, I think, is a very interesting story to tell. So if we talk about signs of impact from contact and continuation with the Viking world around the North Sea, this church establishment is one, but we also have other elements. So the more and more we're starting to find material, especially through metal detecting. So we're very pleased that metal detectorists are keen to work with us as researchers, and we heavily rely on their expertise. We find more and more evidence of connections with the world of the Vikings, with Scandinavia, the Scandinavian homelands, but also with the Danelaw areas, so the Scandinavian areas in England. We mostly get single finds, but also hoards. And in these single finds and hoards, we have dress accessories and jewelry that are the markers for cultural contact with the Viking sphere. They are mainly from the late 9th and early 10th centuries, so they mark a sort of second phase of the Viking activity, if you like, after the initial raids. And these types of objects quite often are personal objects, so they're not necessarily related to trade. They're not trading items, but more personal objects that you would use, both male and female, and they fit into a general Viking North Sea pattern. And Frisia very much mirrors the Danelaw here as well, which I think is an interesting connection. We see the same objects, but also in similar types of context. So mostly as single finds, not as graves, whereas in Scandinavia, you would find them in graves. So that's a real marker of difference there between Scandinavia proper and the diaspora, so to speak. And also, this seems to be a continuation of the tradition that was already present, at least in Frisia, in the period before. So it seems to be a mixture of the regional tradition and the traditions from the Scandinavian homelands. This image has changed quite a bit over the last couple of years because of metal detecting, and I'm hoping to come back to it if I have time at the end of my talk, because I think this is highly, highly relevant. There's something else I wanted to show you, and this relates to another type of object, combs, in this case. And you may be familiar with the work of Dr. Steve Ashby, of York University and his team, who've done large-scale studies on combs and comb manufacture, the use of reindeer antler for combs, and the networks behind it. And they've, for example, researched elements in places like Ribe and Hedeby, and have found some really interesting results. And because of those results, because there were a number of combs that we traditionally would have mentioned were Frisian types, mainly because they were found in Dorestad, they've identified were reindeer antler. This, of course, raised the question about what happens in Frisia and how what are the combs in Frisia made of. So recently, we joined up to do a small case study of the combs in central Frisia on the Terp sites and to look at the use of reindeer there. And this is yet to be published, so not published yet, but we're working on this. And of course, the reason reindeer is very interesting in light of the Viking Age and Viking Age trade and connections is that reindeer antler, of course, could only be sourced from northern Scandinavia. And the presence of the material thus tells us something of the relations between the different areas. So we've looked at, in total, 55 combs of a certain type, certain types from the Terp sites in central Frisia. And they are all from the Frisian Museum collection. And we've looked at the types that were reliably dated to the long Viking Age. And the result is very similar to those in Hedeby and Ribe. And it means that particularly the 9th to 10th century combs of Frisian type, that they without exception were made of reindeer antler. And you can see the sites that we've sampled in the middle, and then on the right you can see the sites where we found the reindeer antler. In total, these are 10 items, and they're all from individual Terp sites, which means that we did not find a hub for reindeer antler or one particular place that would trade in it. No, we see a sort of general spread of the reindeer antler, and we don't see any particular pattern. So it's definitely a widespread phenomenon, which means that these contexts were in place already at the start of the Viking Age and also continued. Now, there's more examples to give. I'll just look at the clock because I think time is running out, so I'll probably have to be a bit quicker. But there's different cases to make for material that we find. So a site where we found the reindeer antler that's very interesting is the site of Dongjum that you can see here, where we also found other material that's related to the Viking world that is of interest. And these are both trading items, but also more personal items, horse harness and related elements. Now, one of the things that also shows us, not just in Dongjum, but in different sites, is the dual economy, silver finds and dual economy. So what we see in Frisia, and this is an example from the work by Dr. Jan Besterman, but there is increasing evidence coming to light since, is that in Frisia, we get a dual economy, meaning that on the one hand, we have evidence of Frisia being part of the Frankish coin economy, so using Frankish coins. And again, Dr. Simon Coupland is the expert on that. But at the other end, we also see that in Frisia, and not in the rest of the Netherlands at least, but in Frisia, we find evidence of the Viking bullion economy, so the silver economy, where it was not about coins, but about the use of silver, pieces of silver in different forms, packed silver, etc. And this all relates to also the 9th and 10th centuries. And this, I think, is a very clear sign of the way in which Frisia is not just simply part of that Frankish world, but also still very much connected to the world around the North Sea, which is now a Viking world. I'll skip this for now and go on to North Frisia, where also we have examples of the Viking silver material, but mainly in hoards. And you see some examples here from various places. Now, what these hoards have, but also what we found in Frisia, in the Dutch Frisian areas, and you see an example here from the island of Texel, are items that relate to the Hiberno-Scandinavian environment. So the Hiberno-Scandinavian environment being the Scandinavian power bases in Ireland. And we believe that this might be related to activities also of the Great Heathen Army. And this is a link that we're only starting to explore now that we've recognized these types of finds. So I think that's a very interesting avenue to explore a bit further. And there's also some written evidence for that, if you're interested, I'm happy to point you to. So written references and other types of evidence I mentioned already, and I want to go briefly through some of them before time runs out. We have a very interesting set of runic inscriptions from different places that point to contact between the Viking world and Frisia in different places. So we have ongoing trading connections, which seem to be represented by the runestones in Sigtuna in Sweden, where in the 11th century there is a mention of Frisian guilds, and we believe that this is ongoing trading relationships through time. But a reference that I personally find very interesting is the one on the bottom from a silver neck ring from Senja in northern Norway, which relates to Frisians, or the guys from Frisia. And there has been a lot of discussion about what this inscription refers to. Is this a specific rate? Could this be a trading mission? Is it something else? Well, linguistically, I believe it can be all. But what we often miss in the discussion is that the text itself is actually written in as a stanza. So it is in the Fornyrdislag, which is one of the meters that's used for epic poetry, epic Norse poetry. And this, of course, means that it's not necessarily, so it's not a simple reference to this happened there and there. It's actually a poetic diction of historic information. And I think, therefore, actually, the question of what specific rate or specific action does this refer to becomes a little bit irrelevant, to be honest, because it may well point to a general sphere or sense of activities and to poetic dictions around it, which does not mean that it's less relevant or less interesting, far from it. Because one of the things that is important to bear in mind, and that goes for Frisia, but also for other areas around the North Sea world at the time of the Viking Age, is that a lot of people relied on oral traditions rather than on written texts. And this is something I think we often fail to capture in our research, but also in our perspective on this period of time. And it's much easier to study a period through the contemporary written sources. That's also how we often are thought to think. But I think it's very important to realize that the oral traditions are actually a key ingredient if we want to understand the history of a place from the perspective of that place. We need to then study the cultural traditions that were in place there. And in Frisia, this was very much oral tradition, which means stories, storytelling, but also legal traditions that were recorded in an oral fashion. And of course, these were written down later, so we have them from the 12th, 13th centuries, very much so the same with Scandinavian sagas. But I do think these together provide a window onto the Viking Age and Viking Age Frisia. So to give you some brief examples, if we talk about the Scandinavian sagas, a very famous one is, of course, the Egil saga. And in Egil saga, what you see is that Egil, being a Viking, he goes everywhere, and he particularly goes to Frisia on a number of occasions. And what we find here is that it paints a beautiful picture of the Frisian landscape as we recognize it today, but also as we recognize it in other written texts from the same period. So we also find it in the Gesta Danorum or in the texts of Adam of Bremen. So clearly, this is the image that people have of Frisia at the time, and that there is a link between the Viking world and Frisia. So very much on each other's radars, which I think is very interesting. But we also have some Frisian texts that were written down in the same period, and I already mentioned that these were stories, but also law texts. In the old Frisian law codes, we get many references, well, not many, but quite a few references to Vikings on different occasions. And we see a number of recurring themes here. So we see the Vikings in relation to the sea, and also protection from the sea, protection against Vikings. We also see this struggle between the northern world and the southern world, and the question of where does Frisia belong? Is it part of this northern world or this southern world? We see the discussion between what's heathen and what's Christian, and also the question of where does the loyalty of Frisians lie, and to whom do you pay taxes? Because in the end, where you pay taxes is where your loyalty lies. And I think this is a beautiful reference, also reminding us of the dual economy that I just mentioned, because there's not just a difference in who you pay tax to, but also how that tax is then paid. So is it a house tax that you pay with money, or is it a tax that you pay in hard silver, for example? So these are some very beautiful pictures, I think, that are being painted. If we do look at some contemporary material that can show us a bit more about the connections, then we get to the skaldic poetry of the late 9th and 10th, and also into the 11th centuries, where, for example, we encounter Frisia and Frisians in the battle lists of King Olaf Tryggvason, but also in the poem Velleklar about another Norwegian king, Olaf Haraldsson, so the Saint Olaf of the 11th century, where they talk of the different battles that were going on in different places in Europe. And here we often encounter the Frisians also among other people, so amongst Scandinavians, amongst the Danes, amongst the Saxons. And it shows you that Frisia was very much part of this world that they were moving in. There's also much more material if you start looking. So, for example, there's the whole body of material around Ragnar Lothbrok and his followers and his family, whether they are historical or legendary, of course, that might be up for discussion. But at least it often refers to Frisia in a number of ways as well, either as places of heritage. So Ubbe, of course, is called a Dux Frisianum. Discussion still around what that means, what his relationship to Frisia was. But clearly, the name Frisia is not strange in the context of the Viking world and also of important peoples within the Viking world. Too much to go into now, but suffice it to say, I think that there is this North Sea coherence and this North Sea story that Frisia is very much part of, that gets reaffirmed all the time, also in Viking context. And it shows you that there is a connection between Scandinavia, the British Isles, and Frisia at the time. You may have noticed that within those traditions, and again, it's cutting a long story short, but that within that tradition, you could see certain regions or people or groups of people becoming almost like a token or a commonplace for certain things, because things are condensed to a storyline and a material. And Charlemagne, as the ruler of the Franks, of course, is one such token figure. But I think Frisians and also Vikings, Danes, they all could be token figures as well. And I think one of our tasks as researchers is to try and understand that a bit more when we do our research, what the exact token or symbol or reference is that people use when they use these terms. And again, I think also that's why the question of is it always a specific event that things refer to becomes a bit irrelevant. This brings us back to the sword pommel fragment that we started with and the question whose it was. Because again, we can't really say whose it was. We don't have a name tag, unfortunately. But I hope that with the story that you've just heard, that at least you get a sort of sense of it's not a strange thing to find a Viking sword pommel from the 10th century, from Norway or from England, along the coast of the Flee in Frisia in this period of time. And that it's not a surprising thing that actually you can give it a wider context of connections in which this fits. And I'm going a bit of edge here, but it's probably safe to suggest that more finds, maybe not exactly like this one, but more finds will certainly show up in the future. And that will help us to paint the picture a bit more and fill it in with a growing body of knowledge and a growing body of finds. And also with growing international collaboration, which is very important if you want to understand this a bit more. Just to show you very briefly, I have one map of the finds that we knew previously and now filled in with a map of finds that from a Frisian perspective have been added. And the other finds, of course, are the parallels from the Frisian perspective. There's much more material than this in general. But I'm hoping that this shows you how important it is that we start filling up these blank spots on the map, because we can. And I hope that also you see how logical it is if you look at the distribution of these finds in the Viking world and the geography of the Viking world in general, how logical it is that these finds actually pop up in Frisia and that there was a real connection with Frisia. And I hope that this image can be painted a better picture for in the years to come. So to finish off, I'll just share with you again some of the key elements, I think, of my story. And that is the importance of understanding the period before the Viking Age to understand Frisia in the Viking Age. And that has to do with those strong North Sea connections. I think the importance of understanding that there is a difference between the political and the cultural or the social context. They are different layers and they do not always match. We have the importance of understanding the landscape. Throughout the Viking Age, the inhabitable coast remains very much cut off from the hinterland through the areas of peat. And this, of course, hugely impacted the way people looked and also ventured, the maritime connections. The importance of understanding the cultural transmission of the area that we study. So again, focusing also on the oral narratives and the legal traditions, because I do believe these contain key information for the area in question. Something I'm very conscious of is the importance of letting go of the national perspective, but studying the regional in an international context instead, and also looking at the interrelation between them. And of course, also the importance of the different phases of the Viking Age. If we study a phenomenon as big as the Viking Age, as well as looking at regional differences, we also need to think about the different periods within the Viking Age that we study. Now, I'm very conscious that, of course, there's much more to this story. There's much more to tell, much more detail, and there might be parts where I've gone really quick or have dwelt too much. But I hope I have given you a broad overview of Frisia and the Viking Age from my perspective. And if there's anything that you are interested in or that you have questions about, I'd love to hear from you very much. Thank you for your attention.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Nelleke. That was absolutely brilliant. Very rich introduction to early medieval Frisia, and a wonderful look at the Viking Age as seen through the Frisian lens, and an important reminder, I think, of the continued importance of Frisia as this fulcrum, this sort of nexus of wider North Sea and European networks throughout the wider period. Also, it's always good to see an upside down map of the North Sea. I try to shoehorn them into presentations as much as I can. It's a good perspective to remind ourselves of, and I think as society members will also know and recognize that our journal has one such map on it as its cover, and has done for the last probably 40 volumes or so. So it's a good reminder that you can actually turn the map upside down. So without any further ado, I would just like to open the floor to questions and to comments. Again, if you have any whatsoever, please put them in the chat. I can see some of them have already arrived, and I'll try to read them out to Nelleke, and I'll try to get to as many as I can as well, also being mindful of time. There is a question from, I'll just start at the beginning, from Leslie Mackay. Have there been any similar finds in Shetland, especially Unst, representing Viking travel through the North Sea to the Frisian areas? Now, that may be a bit specific, I guess, but maybe we could expand on that just a little bit and say, like, are you aware of any sort of material connections from the period between the Scottish region and the Frisian area in particular that you're aware of?
No, it's a very good question, and one I'm hoping to ask in return as well. If you do encounter anything that would indeed symbolize this, I'd be very keen to hear about it, because especially preparing for this talk, I tried to look up what is the connection with the Scottish area, but it's very difficult to find any as of now. We do have the Hiberno-Norse, so the Irish connections, and the Isle of Man. There seem to be connections, but and of course, the Danelaw and maybe the northern part of England. But anything beyond that, I haven't found anything. Also, not with Shetland. But I can't believe that there weren't any connections. It's all part of this shared world. Just as far as I'm aware, no direct evidence there. But if anybody knows of anything, then please do let me know. Maybe you know, Chris.
None off the top of my head that I can.
No.
So I'm no use there at all.
Mm.
Let's move on to the next question then. We've got Matt Edwards who asks, in terms of Frisian settlement in North Frisia, there seems to be a gap between East Frisia and those settlements in the north around the mouth of the Elbe. Is that correct? And if so, are there any particular reasons for this beyond those of topography or geography?
Yes, no, that's absolutely correct. Well spotted. And I'm trying to go back to the maps. So the Elbe-Weser region, the Elbe-Weser Triangle, as it's also known for, in particular, is a non-Frisian area. So it more or less is an area between the different Frisian regions. So the one Frisian region ends around the Weser, and then you have a bit of a gap until you get to the northern Frisian area again. And in between that, often it's said that it is more a Saxon region. It is of a slightly different nature and different connections. So yes, well spotted.
Okay. We have let's see, what more we have. I just saw another question and I've lost it now. Oh no. There's too many questions.
I'm also going,
Yes.
you can
Oh,
see it on
here.
my
Okay.
screen, but
We've
I'm
got
going
we've
to.
got we've got a question. I think this is from Colin. What sources did Frisians have for timber to build seagoing vessels?
Hmm. Yes. Well, they did have timber, so there would have been more trees around than there are today in the Frisian area, and of course, slightly more to the inland. There are regions of forests and trees. So there would have been, unlike, for example, Iceland or the islands, there would have been timber around for shipbuilding. Yes, but I think from as in any other region, some of the because we don't have much Viking Age shipping material, but we do have some early medieval shipping material, and of course also often reused for different purposes. And the ones that have been analysed, some come from the area, but some also come, for example, from England. So I think this is remains an interesting topic as well to look into. Yeah.
Can I use my chairing privileges to throw in a question myself? Um, so you mentioned, and this is sort of, I'm reading between the lines just a little bit. Um, Considering sort of the differences in sort of environmental and social political organization, as well as those sort of demarcations in the Frisian law codes, and
Hmm.
sort of at the same time you see this sort of cultural overlap into Scandinavia, ethno-cultural overlap. And so you alluded to this a little bit, but can we say that there's a sense maybe not of just one Viking Age Frisia, but at least several Frisias? And due to the sort of the sheer variety that we're seeing in sort of cultural identity and in material culture and these types of spatial organizations, do you think we might even be at risk of maybe sort of unduly homogenizing the Frisia region by using a single term, Viking Age Frisia? Just your thoughts on that.
No, I think that's a very, very valid point. And I think this goes for whether you look at a region or look at a period, there's always the risk of sort of condensing it and simplifying it into one story. But yes, it depends on the level that you look at. If you go down into the regions, yes, definitely there would have been quite some difference between the different Frisian areas. There's also quite a bit of difference in the nature of the material source and sources that we have for studying them, which also, of course, creates a difference in our knowledge. But I would at least dare to make the statement that we could definitely distinguish between a West Frisian area, a
Mhm.
Central East Frisian area, and a North Frisian area in terms of sort of the bigger stories that they tell. But this is also why it is sometimes challenging, especially when the sources just simply refer to, for example, a Viking raid in Frisia, well, that is quite a challenge.
Yeah.
It's a bit like saying, oh, it happened in Europe. And what does that exactly mean? So, I think you have a very fair point.
Thanks. Let's see if we have any more questions. We have a point made by Colleen Beatty. Hi, Colleen. There are of course bullion items like weights and
Mm.
pack silver that are all part of the same story and would have been used within the same network. That's a
hmm
very fair point, I think.
Yeah, and I think that might
Um,
relate to the question also about Shetland, and maybe if I'm interpreting it correctly, that of course, even if there might not be a direct link and direct evidence of contact, that indeed you see it's all part of the same story. So yeah, very true.
And then Flora makes a point that that Vikings were, of course, present in Francia, and that there's a dire need for more archaeological finds from there, which I can, which I'm very much on board with.
Yes, me
Um,
too.
and I think then we reached
Can I
the
make one remark on that?
absolutely go for it. Yeah.
Because I absolutely agree, and this is something that we also are looking into, and I agree that's something we need to do more. One of the things to bear in mind if we talk about France is that with the material that we now have in Frisia, a lot of it is metal detected, and of course in France the rules about metal detecting are very different. So in the Netherlands they're quite liberal in terms of we have a good system of recording, quite similar to the portable antiquity scheme in the UK, for example. But in France, metal detecting is more or less illegal, or is illegal. So it also means that the material that you might have to study this is very different. So we would need to approach it in a different way as well.
Yeah, it's like if only we had a portable antiquity scheme in France. That's well, fingers crossed we'll still get there.
Yeah.
Um, we have a question from Jake, who asks if any silver dirhams have been found in Frisia in a way that can be compared to England. I think you mentioned dirhams briefly, but I was wondering, could you
Yes.
elaborate on it?
Definitely, quite a lot of silver dirhams have been found, and they've all been found along the coastline in Frisia. And actually, Simon Coupland, who's in the audience, because I just saw that he was on the chat as well. He has looked into this as well. So definitely, and maybe this is also where I can highlight the project by Jane Kershaw, who is of course looking into the silver and the origins of the Viking Age and the origins of Viking silver and looking also into the dirham material and the use of dirhams, then again in other materials as sources of silver. And I think lots of interesting things are coming out there. Yes.
Brilliant. I think if there are no further questions, I think we can draw proceedings to a close. So if there are any lingering questions or if you've come up with, if there's something you urgently had to ask but forgot to, I'm sure Nelleke would be very happy for you to get in touch through email or social media. Before we go, can we please just thank Nelleke one more time for a brilliant talk and put our digital hands together. So thanks so much, Nelleke. Really appreciate it. And thanks so much for everyone for coming along, and hope to see you all next time. And enjoy your evening or your morning or your afternoon, whichever applies. See you all later. Thanks very much.
Thank you all very much for attending.